2, whoo!
Welcome to Authenticity Lab, a podcast where we celebrate reconnecting with our authentic selves. I'm Dr. Kelsey Miles. I'm a musician, a songwriter, and also a chemistry professor. Each week, I share a new story and break it down with none other than the scientific method to inspire you to live more boldly, lead your life with curiosity so you can discover what truly makes you who you are. This is the final episode of a mini-series on the scientific method and how you can apply it to your life. You can go back several episodes where you see start here, and that's where we did our first step, which was to ask a question. And then in the next episode, we formed a hypothesis. We designed a safe experiment to help you answer that question. You ran the experiment, you collected your data, you analyzed your data, and the last step was to draw a conclusion and share your results. And in today's episode, I'm sharing something very, very important for any kind of personal growth you want to do. And this is the same way that we approach science. And it's that your conclusion is never the final word. Your conclusion is simply a snapshot of the amount of data you currently have. So if you collect more data, you could end up getting a different conclusion. I'll share an example from chemistry and also an example from my own life where with more data, a different conclusion was drawn. I want to address something really, really important. In the world we're in today, there are a lot of people who don't trust science. And I'm here to tell you that science is never wrong. Science is a process. Science is the process of gathering data and drawing a conclusion from that data. That's what science is. And when we see conclusions that are drawn in science and then they are proved to be incomplete and more data actually points to another answer, it doesn't mean the science is wrong. The process that happened was perfect. Data was collected, it was analyzed, and a conclusion was drawn. We do this in our daily lives all the time. And if we were to not trust that process, you would never be able to have any personal growth. And the same is true for science. In many ways, it seems like there's conclusions that are quote unquote wrong. They're really just incomplete. There wasn't enough data, and that was just the conclusion drawn based on the data available. Many people get tripped up on the word conclusion because it's considered to be the end, and that's not true for science. Conclusion is simply describing this is where we're at. This is a timestamp right now based on the data we have. And when you get more data, your conclusion can change. Let me give you an example from science that I find to be kind of hilarious right now. Because we have way more data than they had back in the 1600s. Did you know that they used to think that fire was an element? Like they had water, earth, air, and fire. They thought that fire was a thing. We know now that fire is a combustion reaction. It's burning something. Fire isn't something that you can bottle up and hold. However, they thought you could because you could put it in a torch and you could hold it in a lantern. And anything that burned released this thing called phlogiston. That was completely false. That did not exist. However, that conclusion that they drew about this magical thing called phlogiston that was released when something burned, that conclusion actually led to more experiments, which is where we found out that actually oxygen in the air is required for a combustion or for fire to happen. They realized that when they would burn something, the weight of the ashes would be lower than the weight of the starting wood or whatever they were burning. And that was because combustion was taking place and it lost oxygen and water into the air. That idea that fire was an actual substance rather than just a reaction, it's just heat and oxygen. And if you put enough of that together with some fuel, you will get fire. They literally did not know that. The conclusion changed. Once they ran more experiments, they changed their conclusion. They realized fire is a combustion reaction and it is not an actual substance. It's not an element. It is just a reaction. You see, the science evolved as more data was collected. Adjusting the conclusion when more data is presented is exactly what we can do in our real lives. We don't have to stay stuck on something magical like a phlogiston. And in a way, science never stays stuck. The moment that a scientist shares a conclusion, you can be sure that there are other scientists that are doing relevant or related work. And they'll also share their conclusions. And what happens is that it's the collection of all the experiments together that provide that science community with enough data to draw the most complete conclusion. And what you're doing in this podcast by running these small life experiments, in a way, is giving you the best opportunity to come to the most complete conclusion. However, because we are not a science experiment, when we collect data that points to a conclusion, sometimes those conclusions can get stuck with us. I call these limiting beliefs. Maybe you tried to cook once and burned everything in the meal and you decided you are a terrible cook. Or maybe you were rejected once trying to ask somebody out and something inside of you said, I'm not lovable. Or maybe you struggled some in school and thought, I'm not very smart. Or, oh man, I have some of my students one of my students actually recently told me this, and they shared that they were terrible at math. And I wonder where that belief came from. They must have had an experience where it didn't go well. But here's the thing. Do you really have enough data to let that be the final say? Have you done enough experiments with cooking or school or with asking someone out to really decide that that's the final conclusion? Or did you simply just draw a conclusion based on incomplete data? So let me share a personal story about how I had to be open to getting new data. I drew a conclusion based on incomplete data. I've shared parts of this story before about how I thought I was a bad singer for most of my life, like not great at singing. In high school, I was in a choir and I was constantly told to be quiet. I was singing too loud. I got a 2 in my solo and ensemble. I was pulled to my choir director's office. She asked me what happened. It was like a really bad thing that I didn't score the highest that I think all my other classmates did. And I took that with me. I just assumed I was a terrible singer. And I still sang, sometimes to myself or in the car or something, but I held that belief with me. And that conclusion I drew was based on incomplete data. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school where I was singing in lab, and I shared this story once, and I was singing in lab, and my lab mate, I thought no one was there, and my lab mate heard me, and he said, "You are such a great singer." It scared the crap out of me. And I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were here." And he goes, "No, keep going." And I knew I was feeling the music, and I just really held on to the belief that I wasn't a great singer. And it wasn't until I started to get into more blues and soul and And that was where my voice fit. And so with more data, I started to find out that I was a good singer. I just wasn't a good choir singer. And as I played more shows, I've had so many people tell me my voice gave them chills. My voice is so powerful and so beautiful. And it really made me think about that belief I had and that conclusion I drew. And it was simply incomplete. The data I collected said I wasn't a good singer, and the conclusion I drew was the best conclusion I could have drawn at that point in time. So rather than blaming myself for holding on to that belief, I just accepted that I did the best I could. I got the data from high school. That's what I decided. And then with more data, I had to redraw my conclusion and essentially drop that limiting belief that I'm a bad singer. And this is what we do in life. I bet you've done it too, where you collect a little bit of data and just have a belief that you can or cannot do something. You might have said something to yourself like, I'm not creative, or I'm not a good cook, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not lovable. And these could all be just based on incomplete data. But what if all these conclusions you've been holding on to for years are based on incomplete data and in a sense are now incomplete? And there's a lot more to the story. So why do we avoid collecting new data? Look, our brains are hardwired for survival. And the last thing that our brains want us to do is go step outside of our comfort zone. So the moment that you tried to cook and you burnt the meal and decided you're a terrible cook, that makes it so much more difficult to move forward. Or if you learn that you are a bad painter and decided you weren't creative, it's going to make it so much more difficult to try and paint something. You don't want to step out of your comfort zone and have that hope that maybe something could be different. Or if you believe that you weren't lovable, maybe you aren't going to go ask that person out and you're not going to put yourself out there as much. I get it. I get the comfort zone idea, and it's comfortable. That's why it's called the comfort zone. And at the same time, I guarantee you won't expand and grow if you stay there. You see, the difference with science is science never fears collecting data that makes you draw a different conclusion. That's like the whole point of science. This idea that science gives us this concrete answer is not the way science works. Science is a process. Science loves expanding. It is constant expansion. And so in a way, why I'm inviting you on this podcast to separate yourself from your life a bit and use the scientific method is to lean into the process of exploration, the process of not knowing, the process of using your creativity to see what else is out there. And this is my favorite part about the scientific method. Every conclusion that we draw tends to lead to new questions. If your conclusion, for example, was that you were a terrible cook, maybe a question you would ask would be, what if I tried a different dish? Or what if I tried baking? Or if your conclusion was that you aren't lovable, maybe a question you would have is, what if I just let someone see my true self? What would happen? If your conclusion was, like me, that I'm a terrible singer, a question could have been, what if I sing a different genre? In a way, we do these without even consciously thinking about them. I'm just encouraging you to think about them in case you get stuck, because we all get stuck sometimes where we have these limiting beliefs and we can't move through them. And the only way really out of something, out of some funk or out of feeling stuck is through. So here's what I want you to walk away with from today's episode. Science is never wrong because science is a process. It's a process of gathering data, analyzing that data, drawing conclusions, which lead to new questions that help continue to expand the science. And we can apply that to our own lives. And in the same way that science never gets stuck, the moment that there is new data and a new conclusion, there are new questions. We can do the same thing in our lives. Every time we run an experiment, we can gain more data and keep expanding. The moment that we feel stuck, the moment that we feel like we can't move past a limiting belief, that's your cue. That is your cue to figure out a way to move through that event. And the way that you do that is collecting more data. This curiosity is exactly what you need to forever expand. The world is limitless. Your ability to pick up new hobbies and learn new things and to stretch your imagination and be creative and be fully yourself is limitless. The only way we can get there, though, is if you try stuff. That's the only way. I'm feeling really called to share this right now with you. This idea that you only have a problem if you think you have a problem. So if you're listening to this episode and you're saying, well, I don't feel stuck and I try new stuff all the time, this episode is probably not for you. However, it might have inspired you to keep going, which is what I'd love to see. So that's it. We've done it. This is the end of the mini series where we went through every step of the scientific method. First, we asked a question. I took you through that meditation to find something you're worried about. If you're listening to this now and you haven't done that episode, I encourage you to go back. The second step of the scientific method is to form a hypothesis. This is where we make our educated guesses on what could happen. And this is where I pushed you to make sure you also think about the best case scenario, not just the worst case scenario. In the third step, we ran our experiment and we talked a lot about how to design a good life experiment. In the same way with science, we really try to assess risk and make sure that we're doing this safely. Experiments in our life don't have to be huge. They can be small steps. But the point is that you're moving forward to collect data. And then that's the next step, followed by analyzing the data, which is where we really look at our hypothesis and we see ways in which the data analysis could maybe prove or disprove some of those hypotheses we had, those educated guesses or assumptions, if you'd like to call them that. And the final step is to draw this conclusion. The idea with the conclusion is simply to give yourself a roadmap of where you're at, a timestamp. It's not the final word, as we've just talked about in this episode. Keep your eyes open. Keep your mind open to new data coming in, because that could guide you to something you never even thought. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would share this with one of your friends who also could benefit from running life experiments. I really want to live in a world where we celebrate connecting with our authentic selves and we celebrate expansion and growth, rather than celebrating staying in comfort zones, putting up walls, divisive nature, things based on fear. All of that stuff is so heavy, and there's so much more we can access in this world and in life by entering this kind of thought process. And I know I'm not the only one out there. I know you who is listening right now feels the same way and actively does this in your life. So if you know someone that might have an inkling of this kind of discussion and thought process, please share this with them, because I think we all want a lot of the same thing. And it's nice when you aren't doing it alone, because you aren't doing it alone. Also, if anything came up for you in this episode, feel free to email me at kelsey@kelseymiles.com and send me a message. I love hearing from you. So I think that's everything for our episode and the end of our mini series. I'll be back next week with a new life story, and I'll break it down using the scientific method. And I hope My hope is that these podcast episodes inspire you to live more boldly, lead with curiosity, and keep being your most amazing, authentic self.
Yeah, that house will always call you.